If no one moves, he dies, Ava Johnson heard herself say, though the words barely made it past her lips before the river swallowed the man again, the dark current churning under the bridge like it had something to prove, like it didn't care who it took with it, and for a split second the world around her froze, cars idling, voices stuck mid-breath, rain tapping against the pavement in a steady, indifferent rhythm, until her body moved before her fear could catch up. Sneakers slipping on wet concrete as she dropped her bag and ran, the cold air biting her lungs as she reached the railing and saw him, just a few feet out, arms barely breaking the surface, fingers clawing at nothing, and without thinking about how deep it was or how fast it pulled, she climbed over and jumped, the water hitting her like a wall of ice, knocking the breath out of her chest as the current dragged at her clothes, heavy, relentless, but she kicked forward anyway. Arms cutting through the water, eyes locked on the spot where he disappeared, 1 second, 2, 3, then she saw him again, drifting just out of reach, and she lunged, fingers brushing fabric, then gripping tight, her muscles straining as she pulled him closer, his weight dragging her down for a moment that felt too long, but she pushed harder, forcing both of them upward until her head broke the surface and she gasped, coughing. Rain mixing with river water on her face as she wrapped one arm around his chest and started kicking toward the shore, inch by inch, every movement burning, every second stretching, until finally her feet hit mud, unstable but solid enough, and she dragged him onto the bank, collapsing beside him for half a second before instinct snapped her back, hands pressing against his chest, counting under her breath, trying to steady her shaking fingers, trying not to think about the crowd that had gathered now. The distant wail of sirens getting closer, the whispers rising behind her, because none of that mattered, not yet, not until he breathed again, not until she knew she hadn't been too late. The man's chest jerked under her hands, not a full breath, not yet, just a fragile sign that something inside him was still fighting, and Ava leaned closer, rain dripping from her hair onto his face as she counted again, steady, focused, refusing to let the noise behind her break her rhythm. But the noise kept growing, footsteps splashing through puddles, voices layering over each other, sharp, uncertain, watching, always watching, until a shadow fell across her and someone said, "Step back, miss." But she did not move, not until she felt it, a real breath this time, shallow but undeniable, and only then did her hands pause, hovering for a second like she was afraid to believe it, until the paramedics rushed in, their movements quick and practiced, lifting him onto the stretcher, checking his pulse, attaching monitors that beeped softly against the storm's dull roar, and Ava sat back on the wet ground, her arms suddenly heavy, her fingers trembling now that the urgency had passed, the cold finally sinking into her bones, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe, slow and uneven, watching as they worked on him. Watching as life seemed to return in small, quiet ways, but then the tone shifted, subtle at first, a glance exchanged, a question asked a little too sharply. "What happened here?" And before she could answer, before she could even stand, hands reached for her, not rough, but firm enough to make her freeze, pulling her gently but decisively away from the stretcher, and the space between her and the man she had just saved felt wider than the river itself. "We need you to come with us," one officer said, his voice controlled, measured, but carrying something underneath it that Ava recognized too well, something she had felt before in grocery stores, on sidewalks, in places where people decided who you were before you spoke, and she blinked, rain mixing with something warmer at the corners of her eyes, not tears exactly, just the weight of it all pressing in at once. "I did not hurt him," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the shaking in her hands, but the words seemed to fall short in the heavy air, and around her the crowd shifted. Whispers threading through the rain, some curious, some doubtful, some already certain, and Ava lowered her gaze for a second, not in shame, but in exhaustion, in the familiar feeling of having to prove something that should have been obvious, and as the ambulance doors closed with a hollow thud and the lights reflected red and blue across the wet pavement, she realized that saving a life had not ended anything, it had only begun something she could not yet see, something waiting just beyond the flashing lights and the questions that had not stopped. The patrol car smelled faintly of rain and worn fabric, the kind that held on to every storm that had ever passed through it, and Ava sat in the back seat with her hands resting loosely in her lap, not restrained, but not free either, her wet clothes clinging to her skin as the heater hummed quietly, pushing out air that never seemed warm enough, and outside the window the city blurred into streaks of red and white light. Reflections bending across the glass like something unstable, something shifting, while the officer in the front seat spoke into the radio in short, clipped phrases that sounded routine, almost detached, as if none of this carried weight, as if pulling her away from that riverbank had been just another line in a long day, and Ava kept her eyes forward, replaying the moment in her mind over and over again, the way his hand had slipped beneath the surface, the way she had reached without thinking, the way his chest had finally risen under her palms, because that was the only truth she could hold on to right now, the only thing that felt steady in a situation that was already tilting. And when the car slowed and turned into the brightly lit entrance of the hospital, the sudden flood of white light made her blink, her reflection faint in the glass for a second before it disappeared completely, replaced by motion, by people moving quickly, purposefully, doors opening, closing, voices calling out information she could not quite catch, and then the car stopped. The engine idling for a moment before the officer stepped out, opening her door with a polite but firm gesture, guiding her inside where the air smelled sharp and clean, antiseptic cutting through everything else, and for a second she hesitated, just a fraction of a pause as she crossed the threshold, because something about this place felt different, heavier, like whatever came next would matter in ways she could not yet see. And she was led down a hallway lined with bright lights and polished floors, past rooms where machines beeped softly and curtains swayed slightly with the movement of air, until they stopped near a waiting area where another officer stood, flipping through a small notepad, glancing up as they approached, his eyes scanning her quickly, measuring, not unkind, but not neutral either, and Ava straightened her posture without realizing it, her shoulders pulling back as if preparing for something she had faced before, something familiar in a way she wished it was not, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost practiced. "We just need to understand exactly what happened," he said, and Ava nodded once, slowly, her voice steady when she answered. "I saw him in the water, and I went in after him." Simple, direct, the truth without decoration, but the silence that followed stretched just a little too long, like her words were being weighed against something else, something unseen, and down the hall, beyond the glass doors, she caught a glimpse of movement, a stretcher being rolled past, a glimpse of the man she had pulled from the river, his face pale under the bright lights, and for a moment everything else faded again, the questions, the looks, the quiet tension pressing in around her, because he was still here, still breathing, and that had to mean something, even if no one had said it yet. The question hung in the air longer this time, not loud, not aggressive, but heavy enough to press against her chest, and Ava could feel the weight of their attention settling on her, the subtle shift from curiosity to scrutiny, the way silence stretched just a second too long after every answer she gave, and she kept her voice even, steady, repeating what she knew, what she had seen, what she had done, because there was nothing else to offer. No hidden detail, no dramatic twist, just a simple truth that seemed to grow more complicated the more it was examined, and the officer nodded slowly as he wrote something down, the faint scratch of pen against paper cutting through the low hum of the hospital, while somewhere down the corridor a monitor beeped in a steady rhythm, soft but constant, like a reminder that life was still moving forward just out of reach, and Ava's eyes drifted again toward the glass doors, toward the place where they had taken him, her fingers curling slightly in her lap as if holding on to that moment at the river because that was the only part that still felt clear, everything else now blurred by questions and looks she could not quite read, and then another voice joined in, lower, more deliberate, asking where she had been before the river, what she had been doing, how she had gotten there, and Ava answered each one without hesitation, walking home from her second shift, cutting across the bridge like she always did, hearing the splash, seeing the struggle, acting before thinking, and as she spoke she could feel the story settling into something structured, something official, but not necessarily something believed, and that realization sat quietly beneath her calm, not loud enough to break her composure, but present enough to make her shoulders tighten just slightly, and then the hallway shifted again, a subtle change in energy as footsteps approached with purpose, not rushed but certain, and the officer beside her paused mid-note. Glancing up as a man in a dark coat stepped into view, his presence quiet but commanding, the kind that did not need volume to be noticed, and for a moment everything seemed to still around him, conversation softening, movements slowing, as he spoke briefly with the nurse at the desk, his voice low, controlled, before his gaze lifted and moved down the hall, scanning, searching, until it landed on Ava, and something in his expression changed, not recognition exactly, not yet, but focus, sharp and immediate, and he took a step forward, then another. The polished floor reflecting the movement in faint, broken lines, and Ava felt it before she understood it, that shift again, that invisible line between being questioned and being seen, and she straightened slightly without meaning to, her breath slowing as he stopped a few feet away, his eyes holding hers for just a second longer than necessary, as if placing her somewhere in a memory he had not fully reached. And behind her the officer cleared his throat, ready to continue, ready to bring the moment back into procedure. But something had already changed, something quiet but undeniable, like the first crack in a surface that had seemed solid only seconds before. The man in the dark coat stopped just short of the invisible line that separated Ava from the officers, and for a moment no one spoke, the air holding a quiet tension that felt sharper than any raised voice, and when he finally did speak his tone was calm but carried weight, the kind that shifted attention without effort. "Is she the one who pulled him out?" he asked, not looking at the officers but at Ava, as if the answer was already somewhere in her posture, in the way she held herself despite everything, and one of the officers responded with a measured nod, flipping a page in his notepad as if to anchor the moment back in procedure. "She says she did?" he replied, the choice of words careful, neutral, but not fully committed, and Ava felt that distinction settle in her chest, the difference between being heard and being believed, and the man's gaze did not waver, his eyes studying her not with suspicion but with something quieter, something closer to recognition that had not yet found its full shape, and he stepped closer, just enough to narrow the space, the polished floor reflecting his movement in soft, broken lines. "What is your name?" he asked, and Ava answered without hesitation, her voice steady. "Ava Johnson." And something in his expression shifted again, subtle but real, like a memory aligning with the present, and behind them the low hum of hospital machines continued steady, indifferent, while the rain tapped faintly against the windows, softer now, as if the storm itself was beginning to pass, and the officer beside her cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the conversation. "We are still gathering details," he said, but the man raised a hand slightly. Not dismissive, just enough to pause the flow, and for a second the room adjusted around that gesture, recalibrating without resistance, and Ava watched it happen, that quiet transfer of attention, that shift in who was being listened to, and she felt something unfamiliar settle alongside her exhaustion, not relief, not yet, but the possibility of it, and then the man spoke again, his voice lower now, more personal. "He is conscious," he said, and the words seemed to land differently than anything else that had been said so far, cutting through the layers of doubt and procedure with simple clarity, and Ava's breath caught just slightly, her fingers tightening in her lap before she could stop them, and the officer frowned faintly, glancing toward the hallway as if confirming the information. "We were not informed of that yet," he said, but the man's focus remained on Ava, unwavering. "He asked about the girl from the river," he continued, and this time there was no ambiguity in his tone, no distance, just a direct connection that pulled the moment into something new, something undeniable, and Ava felt it fully then, that shift she had sensed before but could not name, the movement from being a question to being an answer, from being examined to being needed, and for the first time since the river, the weight pressing on her chest eased just slightly, not gone, but changed, as if something on the other side of those glass doors was beginning to speak for her in a way no explanation ever could. The hallway grew quieter after those words, not silent, but softer, like everything had shifted just a few degrees out of alignment, and Ava stood there for a moment without moving, her breath steady but deeper now, as if her body was finally catching up to everything it had been holding back since the river, and the man in the dark coat stepped slightly to the side, opening a path without saying it directly. A gesture subtle but unmistakable, and the officer beside her hesitated, his pen hovering above the page as he glanced between them, weighing procedure against something less defined, something harder to write down, and Ava felt that hesitation like a pause in time, a space where everything could still turn one way or another, and she did not speak, did not rush it, just stood there with her shoulders squared and her hands still, letting the moment settle on its own, and then the officer lowered his pen, not fully convinced. Not fully resistant either, just yielding enough to let the next step happen, and Ava took a breath before moving forward, her shoes making a soft sound against the polished floor as she followed the man down the hallway, each step measured, each second stretching slightly longer than the last, and the lights above cast a steady glow, reflecting off the walls in a way that made everything feel almost too clear, too exposed, and yet there was a calm beginning to form beneath it all, not loud, not certain but present, like the first hint of warmth after standing in the cold for too long, and as they reached the glass doors the man paused, his hand resting lightly on the handle as he looked at her again, this time with something more settled in his expression, something that no longer searched but recognized, and he opened the door slowly, the quiet click echoing faintly in the space, and Ava stepped through, the air inside cooler, sharper, filled with the soft rhythm of machines and the low murmur of voices that did not rise above necessity. And there, at the far end of the room, she saw him. Propped slightly upright, a blanket pulled over his chest, his face pale but no longer distant, no longer unreachable, and for a moment she stopped, not out of fear, but out of the weight of it, the distance between a stranger in the water and a person breathing in front of her now, and he turned his head slowly, as if sensing her presence before fully seeing her, and when his eyes found hers, something quiet passed between them, something that did not need explanation, not yet. And Ava felt her shoulders drop just slightly, the tension easing in a way she had not allowed until now, and the room held that silence gently, not pressing, not demanding, just allowing it to exist, as if even the space understood that this was the moment everything began to change. He looked at her as if the room had emptied of everything else, as if the machines, the lights, the quiet footsteps outside the door had all stepped back to make space for a single truth neither of them had spoken yet, and Ava felt it in the stillness, in the way his breathing slowed when her presence settled in the doorway, not steady yet, but stronger than before, and she took a few steps closer, careful, not wanting to disturb the fragile balance that seemed to hold him there, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence not awkward but full, like something waiting to be understood rather than explained, and then his voice came, low, rough at the edges but clear enough to carry. "You stay," he said, not as a question, but as a realization, and Ava blinked slightly, her hands resting loosely at her sides. "I could not leave you there," she answered, simple, direct, the same way she had answered everything else, and something in his expression shifted again, deeper this time, like a door opening behind his eyes that had been closed for a long time, and he studied her face as if committing it to memory, not out of obligation, but out of something closer to disbelief, as if kindness without expectation was something he had not seen in years, and the man in the dark coat remained near the door, silent now, observing, his earlier certainty replaced by a quiet respect that did not need to be announced. And the faint sound of a monitor continued its steady rhythm beside the bed, a soft reminder that this moment was real, grounded, not something imagined or exaggerated, and Ava felt her breath settle into that rhythm, matching it unconsciously, her shoulders easing just enough to let the weight she had been carrying shift into something lighter, something shared, and the man on the bed turned his head slightly, wincing not in pain but in effort, his gaze never leaving hers. "They said you jumped in without knowing who I was?" he continued, his voice steadier now, carrying more strength with each word, and Ava nodded once, a small motion. "I did not need to know," she said, and that answer seemed to land harder than anything else, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable in its clarity, and he exhaled slowly, a breath that carried something more than recovery, something closer to release, and for a second his eyes closed, not in exhaustion, but in recognition, as if he had just found something he had not realized he had lost, and when they opened again there was no distance left in them, no barrier of status or assumption, just a direct, human connection that erased everything else that had stood between them before, and Ava stood there quietly, not expecting anything, not asking for anything, simply present in the moment she had created without intending to, and the room held that silence gently, the kind that did not need to be filled, because in that space something had already shifted in a way that could not be undone. The quiet between them did not break, it deepened, settling into something that felt almost sacred, and Ava stood there as the man slowly shifted against the pillows, his breathing steadier now, his gaze clearer, as if each second was returning a piece of himself he had nearly lost, and when he spoke again his voice carried more weight, not from strength alone but from intention. "Most people would have waited," he said, his eyes still fixed on hers, "or walked away." And Ava tilted her head slightly, not defensive, not proud, just honest in the way she had been from the beginning. "Most people were there," she replied softly, and that answer lingered, filling the space with a truth that needed no explanation, and the man exhaled slowly, his hand resting lightly against the blanket as if grounding himself. In the moment, and for the first time, there was something like humility in the way he looked at her, something that did not belong to the image he carried outside these walls, and near the doorway the man in the dark coat shifted his stance, stepping forward just enough to be heard without interrupting. "Mr. Whitmore," he said quietly, and the name seemed to ripple through the room, subtle but undeniable, as if it carried a history that extended far beyond this moment, and Ava's eyes flickered. For just a second, not in shock, not in disbelief, but in recognition of what that name meant in a world she had only observed from a distance, and the man on the bed closed his eyes briefly, acknowledging it, accepting it, before looking back at her with something more grounded, something less defined by titles. "That is who I am out there," he said, his voice calm, almost reflective. "But it is not who you saw in the water." And Ava held his gaze steady, unchanged. "I saw someone who needed help," she said, and that answer seemed to settle something inside him completely, like the final piece of a thought he had been searching for without knowing it, and for a moment neither of them moved, the machines continuing their quiet rhythm, the lights steady above them, the world outside still turning without pause, but inside that room something had shifted into alignment, something simple and rare. And then Mr. Whitmore turned his head slightly toward the man in the dark coat, his expression firm now, decisive in a way that carried authority without needing to raise his voice. "Make sure her name is cleared," he said, each word measured, leaving no room for doubt, and the man nodded immediately, already stepping back toward the door, already moving to carry out something that no longer needed explanation, and Ava felt it then, the invisible weight that had followed her from the river beginning to lift, not completely gone, but no longer pressing down with the same force, and she took a slow breath, her shoulders easing as she stood there, not as someone being questioned, not as someone being judged, but simply as herself, and Mr. Whitmore looked back at her one more time, his expression softer now, but still carrying that quiet certainty. "You gave me something back today," he said. And Ava did not ask what it was, because somehow she already understood that it was not just his life, and the room held that understanding gently, without needing to say anything more. The room did not rush to fill the silence after his words, it held it, carefully, as if anything louder might break what had just been restored, and Ava stood there for a moment longer, her breathing steady now, her hands no longer trembling, the weight that had followed her from the river finally settling into something lighter, something she could carry without strain, and Mr. Whitmore leaned back slightly against the pillows, his eyes still on her but softer now, no longer searching, no longer questioning, just present, and outside the window the rain had slowed to a fine mist, the glass catching faint streaks of light from passing cars, reflections moving slowly like time itself had decided to ease its pace, and Ava took a small step back, not out of distance but out of understanding, recognizing that this moment had reached its natural end, not abruptly, not unfinished, but complete in a quiet way that did not need more words, and Mr. Whitmore gave a slight nod, a gesture. Simple but full, something that carried gratitude without needing to say it again, and she returned it just as simply, her expression calm, unchanged by everything she had learned about him, as if none of that altered what mattered. And then she turned toward the door, her steps light against the polished floor, the sound barely there, and as she passed the man in the dark coat he stepped aside without speaking. His earlier authority now replaced by a quiet respect that followed her without needing to be shown, and the hallway outside felt different than before, not because it had changed, but because she had the same lights overhead, the same distant sounds, but the tension that had once filled the space was gone, replaced by something open, something resolved, and the officers who had stood there earlier no longer met her with questions, only brief glances that shifted away just as quickly, as if the answers had already been given elsewhere, and Ava walked past them without pause, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze forward. And when she reached the hospital exit the doors slid open with a soft mechanical hum, letting in the cool night air that brushed gently against her face, carrying the faint scent of rain and pavement, and she stepped outside, the city stretching out in front of her, unchanged, moving, alive, and for a moment she stood still on the sidewalk, her breath visible in the cool air, her clothes still damp but no longer heavy, and she looked up at the sky where the clouds were beginning to part just enough to let a thin line of light through. Subtle, easy to miss, but there, and she did not smile, did not say anything, she simply exhaled, slow and steady, and began to walk, her steps blending into the rhythm of the city, leaving behind a night that had started with doubt and ended in something quieter, something stronger, something that did not need to be seen to be real. And somewhere behind her, in a room filled with soft light and steady machines, a man who had once stopped believing in people lay awake, no longer searching for what he had already found.